My name is Danny Anderson. I'm a faculty member here at KU, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and I'm also the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I just want to welcome and thank all of you for being here to participate in the conference today on big data and uncertainty. But I also want to especially thank Kari Kraus and Brian Rosenblum for all of their work as the co-directors for our Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities and organizing to bring us all together. There are a lot of things that I would love to say in terms of talking about why this conference and all of your work is really important. I'm going to keep it really brief to 2 points. One, we're doing a lot of work as a university thinking about identifying strategic themes that we are working on. And one of them specifically has to do with thinking about information and technology in ways that we are trying to be more intentional about building curriculum and infrastructure and ways we can organize ourselves to be much more effective in what we're doing. And so this is everything that Ariane and Brian have been doing is a great push, encouragement, support, challenge for things that we need to be doing. The other thing that I would say is that there's one comment is, I'm thinking about, I was participating in a couple of the workshops on Thursday, and I keep remembering a phrase out of a book by Jane McGonigal that I really like. And I went back and looked at it just to remember, and she's talking about why she thinks game design is so important in the 21st century in terms of it being much more than just a technological craft, what it is in terms of pushing us to think and do things in a very different way. And then she ends that with this comment, and she says, I want all of us to be responsible for providing the world at large with a better and more immersive reality. And that phrase, immersive reality, is the one that really stands out for me in terms of thinking about how, as we look at technology, as we look at new approaches to the humanities, ways that we are trying to think about how do we increase engagement so that our understanding is far more immersive than it has been in some of the kinds of approaches we have used right now. It's not, I'd say the sessions that I was in on Thursday really posed the question well of how we are learning new things, not simply doing the same thing in different ways, and that more immersive experience of our fields, our disciplines, our reality is really what we're going to be doing as we move forward. So it's a real pleasure thinking about those topics to be able to introduce Kari Kraus. She teaches on the faculty at the University of Maryland. She has a wonderful appointment that is identified as being in the College of Information Studies and the Department of English. And if you have followed any of her editorials or publications, New York Times, Huffington Post, watch the way that she is bringing so many pieces of information together in terms of the way that she looks at new media and digital humanities, textual scholarships and print culture, digital preservation, and I would add the word curation that probably should be added to the description of what she does, transmedia storytelling, and she works in game studies. And it was great to see on her blog the announcement of her book contract for Hopeful Monsters, computing, counterfactuals, and the long now of things that probably brings together a lot of the kind of ideas that I am referencing in my introduction for her. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome her in her presentation, Phylogenetic Futures, Big Data, and Design Fiction.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Danny and Brian and Ariane and the entire DH community here at the University of Kansas. My presentation today is largely based on the book, and it's still in early stages. And so I'll be particularly interested in feedback and ideas for other directions I should be going in. So an overview of some of the sort of central themes of this talk. First of all, the humanities as a future-oriented discipline. Now, I think we often take this for granted, that even when we're studying history or literary history, that what we do has implications for the present and the future. But we don't always make that explicit. I think there's still a tendency to sort of divide the disciplines along sort of lines of temporal orientation, that the humanities are disciplines of the cultural record, as Marcia Bates calls them. And we often use the language of cultural heritage, the cultural record, the creative record, and so forth. And the sciences are often predictive and forward-looking. And C.P. Snow sort of encapsulated this line of thinking in his Two Cultures book, where he says something along the lines of, scientists have the future in their bones, and humanists act as if it doesn't exist. And so a lot of what I'm interested in is the way in which humanists, designers, artists think about, represent, and model, and enable possible futures. So I'll be touching on that theme in direct and indirect ways throughout this presentation. The second is the humanities as a design discipline, and the digital humanities as a design discipline. And I think we're just sort of starting to see this emerge in a lot of ways. It's consonant with the emphasis on making and doing and tinkering that you see in a lot of recent discussions around digital humanities. So certainly in Jeff Rockwell's talk yesterday, when he mentioned the concept of thinking through. Steve Ramsey has been a notable advocate for this idea. And we're starting to see the digital humanities turn in the direction of things like soft circuits, paper-based computing, physical computing in general, that I think will continue to move us in this direction. But we still don't have a lot of interaction with fields like, the digital humanities doesn't have a lot of interactions with fields like human-computer interaction, which is essentially a design discipline that comes out of computer science and cognitive science and some others. So I'll be shaping that theme as well. And then finally, the humanities as a multi-method discipline. So the theme for this conference or symposium is big data. And I'll be talking some about a method, Phylogenetics, that has interesting applications in terms of analyzing cultural materials. But I'm not only talking about big data. And here I'm sort of taking a page from the social sciences and the hard sciences. I'm in an information school, so a lot of what I do is about, I feel almost like I've been an ethnographer for 5 years or so in the information school. My PhD is in English literature. So I'm this sort of doing sort of field studies is what I feel like. And learning what I think might be interesting to import over to the humanities. And multi-method or mixed methods approaches is one of those things that I don't think we're still talking a lot about in DH. And so what you see in the realm of, say, anthropologists working in cultural evolution is that they do big data phylogenetic analyses of cultural objects, but they also do things like lab experiments, smaller scale qualitative and quantitative studies. And the idea with multi-method research is that you're often triangulating among several research methods to see where findings converge on one another, or you're extending findings with one method by using another method, or trying to verify the findings of one method using another method. So really what I'm going to do today is talk about some ways that smaller scale studies and lab experiments might be used to support some of the big data directions that we're interested in right now. And the concept I'm going to discuss that sort of brings together the two themes of futurity and design is design fiction. So I'll be saying a little more about this in some subsequent slides. But a definition right now is design fiction is the practice of mocking up or prototyping objects that embody our ideas about the future. The term was coined, I believe, by Bruce Sterling, the science fiction writer, and further elaborated by Julian Bleecker at Nokia Design, who I also believe has an adjunct appointment somewhere, somewhere in California, I believe, and runs a futures lab. And then it's also been referred to by Stuart Candy as object-oriented futuring because, say, unlike science fiction, you're working with material objects, not text. Stuart Candy, by the way, is a recent PhD graduate of the Futures program at the University of Hawaii, which is located in the political science department. And it's been getting a lot of attention in the last few years, largely because of Stuart Candy's work. And you're starting to see other futures programs springing up. And so Julian Bleecker, further elaborating on design fiction, one can do science fiction not only as a writer of stories, but also as a maker of things. And then finally, a kind of almost epigraph for the idea is a quotation by Barbara Adam, who's summarizing Hans Jonas. she says, she's a sociologist of time and of futurity. And she says, paraphrasing again, the unknown is always with us as an invisible co-object. And so design fiction, I think, is about bringing those invisible co-objects, making them manifest. And I'm going to be connecting design fiction with the area of phylogenetics, partly because I think a lot of design fiction, you look at it and you don't fully understand what the methodology is. It seems to be based a lot on intuition and provocation. And so I've been exploring or thinking about ways to boost the methodology behind design fiction. So I wanted to mention, in conjunction with phylogenetics, this symposium that the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities is offering in the spring. The Shared Horizons Symposium, which brings together bioinformatics researchers working in the area of phylogenetics, sequence alignment, which Jeff Rockwell talked about yesterday, and which I'll also be saying something about, and network analysis. So bringing those folks together with humanists, with digital humanists, and seeing if we can think about collaborations on biomedical-driven humanities research. It's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, but also the National Institutes of Health is kicking in some funding. The UK Council of Research and the National Library of Medicine are also contributing. So applications are due sometime in November, so if you're interested, take a look. Just Google for the Shared Horizons. This is a quotation by my colleague, Ben Schneiderman, who's a pioneer in the field of human-computer interaction and founded the HCI lab on the University of Maryland campus. And he recently said this in an email to the HCI listserv. I believe that the balance is shifting from the natural sciences to the design sciences. The exploration of the natural world will continue, but the pressing problems of our civilization are more likely to be solved by an increasing emphasis on the made world. And I concur with Schneiderman on this sort of really fascinating, interesting research emerging in the area of design science. But where I would depart is that it's a shift from the natural sciences. I think, and that's sort of again a theme today, is that there's ways in which to bring these two together in interesting ways. And you see it, for example, in biomimicry, which is about design that draws on the biological sciences. Sort of studying their systems and processes and applying them to the design of the made and artifactual world. Okay, so phylogenetics and design fiction. Well, here's a couple of interesting things to start with before I get in a little bit more to design fiction. This is a split screen, so on the left is you're seeing the sound system of a fictional constructed imaginary language, a conlang as they're called. This is the sound system for both consonants and vowels. If you've never encountered the conlang community, take a look. It'll go down a rabbit hole, you might never come out of it, but it's really riveting. And for the long-term DHers, the man who has run the conlang listserv for many, many years, I don't know if he still is David Durand, Ellie Melonis's husband, and he's a computer scientist at Brown University. And he's typical of the kind of person who does this sort of thing. It's a fascinating mix of those with backgrounds in cognitive science, in computational linguistics, and literature, in libraries. And one of my own professors from my days at the University of Rochester, where I did my PhD, Sarah Higley, she's very active in this community. She publishes under the pen name of Sally Caves, and she's been developing her own conlang since she was about 9 years old. And it seems as fully rich and nuanced as any natural language. But the language on the left purports to be a future language that descends from English sort of set about 2,000 years in the future. The image on the right is an example of what's often called alternate evolution or speculative evolution. And this comes from a book called After Man, I can't remember the subtitle right now, by a Scottish geologist, Douglas Dixon, who's published a variety of books on this idea. And he borrows phylogenetic concepts in order to plot the evolution of future species set 50 million years in the future. And so this particular beast is supposedly descended from modern-day pigs. So that's actually not a trunk that you're looking at. That's an extended snout of some sort. He postulates that at this point in time, Africa and Asia have fused entirely together, and these animals sort of live in the tropical rainforest of Africa. And then one other thing to return to the idea of mixed or multi-method research. Cory Doctorow has this interesting quotation where he said that algorithms are statistically expressed opinions. They're not neutral, they're political. And so again, one idea behind multi-method research is that we can try to find additional ways to test the assumptions and predictions of the mathematical models that are encoded in algorithms. One place where you see, so I just want to give an example of the kind of adjunct or auxiliary study that is frequently cited among those doing phylogenetic research in anthropology is this early study by the psychologist Frederick Bartlett. It's from a book called Remembering. So it's published in 1932, but still very, very frequently cited, and there have been a ton of follow-on studies. And what he did is a series of essentially transmission chain experiments. So we know these by the name of telephone, right? The game of telephone that we do as kids, where we whisper a message in a friend's ear, and they repeat it to another friend, who repeats it to another friend. By the time it circles the whole room, of course, the message has been incredibly distorted and filled with errors. One of the things that Bartlett did was he also applied the transmission chain experiment to pictorial material. And you're seeing some of the results of one of those studies up here. Same idea, where a first test subject is given an initial image to copy. In this case, the Egyptian hieroglyphic for owl. And then their copy, and I should stipulate, they don't have access while they're copying to the model. They were given the model to study for a few minutes, then the model is taken away, and then 5 minutes or so later, they reproduce what they saw from memory. So one test subject copies the model. Their copy is given to the next test subject who doesn't see the original, and so forth through multiple generations of copying. So you can see just what he found over many experiments like this is that the distortion is it's not random. There are systematic patterns that you start to see. And so this one illustrates some of them. Initially, the image becomes more schematic and non-representational, so that by the end of the second row, beginning of the third row, you can no longer tell what it's supposed to denote or represent. And then it gradually starts morphing from an owl into a cat. And then along the way, you see things like duplication of detail. So the tail of the owl, at one point it's duplicated and it changes location on the animal, and eventually it becomes the wing of the owl, and then eventually becomes the tail of the cat. Bartlett notes that in almost every experiment of this kind that he's done, duplication of detail happens over and over again, as does relocation of detail. I've actually done another version of this experiment where I had subjects actually look at the test model, so continue having access to the model during copying, and then introduce a time constraint doing it, because I've studied a lot of scribal practices, and rapidity is often a virtue in scribal copying, and came up with some, given the nature of the changes I made, some different results. Okay, so design fiction again. A concrete example, this is from the MIT published book that came out in 2010 or 2011, Non-Object. And it's a book filled with marvelous, counterfactual, future-oriented objects. So these are fairly typical. So on the left you see a cell phone that has, the idea behind this is that our devices that we use on a daily basis are so pristine and perfect that they're not an honest reflection of the way we treat our objects and go about our daily lives. And so this particular cell phone is distressed, it's used, it's worn, and sort of has this dog-eared look about it. And then the other object you see is cutlery, future-oriented cutlery built from a counterfactual material called thinnium, which is, as you can see, it's self-descriptive. It allows for very, very thin structures that are nonetheless incredibly strong. Another place you might have seen some design fiction is Wired magazine. They have a long-running series, Artifacts from the Future, that appears at the end of the magazine. And then design fiction, I think, has a tendency to sound very whimsical, and I'm all for whimsy. Whimsy is a great end in and of itself. But I want to use a phrase that Gregory Crane used the other night, which is, he spoke about the economics of intellectual life. And there is a real economics around design fiction. And so I'm going to speak for just a minute about that. There's real application spaces for this. So I was thrilled that Danny mentioned Jay McGonigal in his opening remarks, because these games that I have on the screen are all McGonigal games. And she works in an area called alternate reality games. Does everybody know what an alternate reality game is, or should I define it? Is it if you don't know, is there anybody who doesn't know? Okay. So this is a game that the game is distributed across multiple channels. The story is told over multiple channels or media. So you often see this. It's a big thing with a lot of kids' books right now, or young adult books. So a concrete example would be Kathy's book, which was published in about 2006, that purports to be the diary of a young impetuous woman who there's some incredible sort of supernatural mystery surrounding her boyfriend, and she's constantly getting into trouble. You buy the book on Amazon or in a bookstore. It looks like it's just a typical hardbound book or softcover book, but it also comes with a packet of evidence or materials on the side that includes things like photographs and newspaper clippings and phone numbers scrawled on napkins. And in order to have the full experience of this sort of hybrid game literature work, you have to branch out beyond the pages of the book. You have to start calling the phone numbers, visiting websites, even tracking down, going to visit real physical locations. So this is a good example of an alternate reality game. It's played out over multiple media and multiple platforms. And so McGonigal specializes in this kind of game. And within the last few years, she's started pioneering a subgenre of it called massively multiplayer forecasting games, the future orientation. Most of them are set in the very near future, 10, 15, 20 years. The first one was World Without Oil, which was launched in 2007 with Ken Eklund. Ken Eklund was actually the main designer. And it posited a post-peak energy world where there was a massive shortage of oil. And players, which numbered close to 2,000, had to find creative and intelligent ways to survive the crisis. And they would post on a daily basis to the site. Many of them took actions in the real world, like started growing their own gardens and adopting sustainability practices. And they created a lot of design fiction objects. In all of these games, both the players and the designers create posters 3D models in virtual worlds, a lot of things that then are meant to help them immerse themselves in the gameplay and further develop the storyline. And then another one that I want to mention here is Superstruct, which came out in 2008. Superstruct set in the year 2019, and a global awareness system, a sort of AI agent, has determined through running a series of simulations that the human population has only 23 years left to live unless they take drastic actions. And so players have to confront a variety of super threats, 5 super threats in all, that include things like, they have names like quarantine or ravenous, generation exile, and they have to deal with problems like poverty and disease and so forth. And so the idea behind this game, as with all her games, is to crowdsource really creative solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems. There were, I think 8,000 players. And what's very interesting is that this was sponsored by the Institute for the Future in California, which is McGonagall's employer. And McGonagall and her team of collaborators used the results of this game, the players' sort of ideas, as the basis for the Institute for the Future's annual report sent out to its Fortune 500 companies, which are its clients. So again, the economics of intellectual life. In 2006, the state of Hawaii commissioned Jim DeTore and some of his graduate students in the Futures program at University of Hawaii to, as part of a sustainability project, to engage the public through a series of immersive, future-oriented scenarios. And they developed something like 4 of them, where they had, a large number, a huge percentage of the local population turned out and experienced these 4 alternative futures. Again, lots of design fiction artifacts. And then finally, you might have heard of Brian David Johnson. He's resident futurist at Intel Corporation, and his job is to develop an actionable computing vision for the company for the year 2020. And he also, I think, runs the Tomorrow Project, which is where Intel brings in visiting science fiction writers as part of this effort. And then one more, my favorite. Normally design fiction is set in the near future, and the objects of the design fictions themselves are intended for an audience in the present. They're not intended for future audiences. This is a project set 10 million years in the future that was sponsored by the Department of Energy in the early 1990s. They assembled a group of scientists, semioticians, and others, language experts, and so forth, material science researchers, to try to develop warning systems that would warn future civilizations, again 10,000 years in the future, about buried nuclear material that will still be hazardous at that time. And so 2 teams were charged with developing very comprehensive ideas or plans, and you see some of the ideas here. They produced pictograms, monuments, or mock-ups, I should say, mock-ups of monuments, kiosks, all sorts of, just design fiction type artifacts. And it's one of the eeriest documents I've ever read in my life. It's, again, commissioned by the Department of Energy, and yet Team F opens its report by quoting in full Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, a 14-line sonnet that deals with arrogance and the wreckage of time before they begin their formal report. So Ozymandias in a Department of Energy report, signaling their realization of the futility of the task with which they've been charged, but nonetheless producing a truly astounding set of ideas. And so you see some of the landscape ideas around the menacing earthworks and the spike field. And then really one of the funniest ones, unintentionally, is the one on the left, which is intended to indicate that hazardous materials are below. But as a number of commentators have pointed out, it could be interpreted as something like drill here, right? The exact opposite of what's wanted. Okay, so design fiction methodologies. Let's go to phylogenetics. This is an area that has broad applications of methodology across multiple fields. What you're looking at here are trees of history from the 19th century, created in the 19th century, across the disciplines of textual scholarship, historical linguistics, and then biology. So one is Darwin's tree of life, right, from the origin of species. That's in, I hope I didn't mislabel them, but yeah, that's the one on the upper right. And then on the left is a schematic visualization. So in textual criticism, we call phylogenetic schematics. So really almost identical methodologies. That gives the genealogical relationships of a series of Swedish legal texts dating from medieval times. And then finally, a linguistic tree showing a tree of Slavic languages, showing their interrelationship of Slavic languages. Again, all produced in the 19th century within about 40 years of one another. There's a fair amount of circumstantial evidence that the textual scholars' work was known by the linguists and the biologists, and so there might have been, lines of influence that were. It's not. I should say, clear at all that these methods were independently developed in the three disciplines. There might have been some cross-pollination happening. I've marked the units of analysis here because in phylogenetics or schematics, or the comparative method as it's known in linguistics, you must be able to break your object down, your texts or your languages or your organisms or species into discrete units. You must have clear units of analysis. So that's letters or words in textual criticism. It's phonemes in historical linguistics, and it's what are called characters in biology. And I'm going to say more about characters. The idea of the unit of analysis is really critical, as I just said. So what you're seeing here is in textual criticism, an attempt to collate part of Shakespeare's King Lear across three different versions of it. Collation is, if you're doing schematics, collation is a necessary pre-step. You have to collate all of your texts to find where they agree and disagree before you can start charting their evolutionary relationships. And this is the notation that we've developed, right? This is what you see in an apparatus of variants. You've got the base reading or the lemma, followed by a bracket, and then it indicates where the source, which in this case is one of the folios, one of the Shakespeare folios, followed by alternate readings and other sources. And so the unit of variance here is really the word, right? And notice there's no attempt to address differences like font style or size across the three versions. In order for this approach to work, you've got to separate signal from noise. You've got to have some way of saying this information is incidental, we don't have to pay attention to it, and this information is more central. In phylogenetics, the task is much more difficult, or actually it parallels it. Historically, evolutionary biologists have worked with morphological or physiological characters, body parts essentially. They might compare the teeth of different species in order to chart those evolutionary relationships. And then they get into all kinds of problems with the unit of variance. For example, if you're dealing with teeth, do you treat all of the teeth as a single character or each individual tooth as its own character? They run into this problem all the time. When you're doing evolutionary biology with morphological characters, that's a recurring problem. In recent times, they've turned to molecular data. I'm going to actually skip this one. So nucleotide or amino acid sequences. And this is a representation of the kind of sequence alignment that Jeff Rockwell mentioned yesterday. So this is basically what you're looking at is the bioinformatics version of textual collation, right? This is their notation for doing what we call collation, where you align different sequences from different species And you try to optimize or maximize the number of matches using software. This is not done manually anymore, although often the results are manually tweaked after you run them through a software program. And then you start, basically the idea with a lot of phylogenetic algorithms is that they work on the notion of similarity and difference. So the more similar two sequences are to each other, the more likely it is that those two species share a recent common ancestor. The more dissimilar the sequences are, the more likely it is that they have a more remote common ancestor. Now, what happens when you bring phylogenetics into anthropology and start dealing with objects, artifacts? Once again, the problem of characters becomes very, very complicated. What you see over and over, I think, in this research literature is either very little attention to how characters are derived, or a tremendous variety of approaches. And this is part of a phylogenetic analysis of cutlery, dating from, it's European cutlery dating from like the 16th century forward, up until the 20th century. And you can see that they're trying to identify parts, right? They're trying to subdivide the objects into discrete parts, the length of the blade and so forth. And this is a table that shows some of the different characters and the different character states that are being charted and then run through the phylogenetic software to eventually produce something like this. And then this is done with all kinds of objects, bicycles, arrowheads, and so forth. Now there are alternate methods. This is actually from Darcy Thompson's On Growth and Form from the early 20th century. It's now called Morphometrics. And this process involves not chunking the character into discrete parts, the organism, but rather just in a sort of topological distortion method, warping the image along the grid, and then measuring the amount and direction of displacement between the species that you're comparing, in this case, two species of fish. So this is a continuous rather than discontinuous method, but that's a little bit misleading because ultimately, even people who use this approach today then start subdividing the fish into different regions to compare the morphometric analysis across different regions. So you still rely on discrete analysis. This is a more sort of modern day version where two species of fish have been marked up with landmark points, these constellations of landmarks that establish points of correspondence between the species, and then again you perform the morphometric analysis. I'm going to skip this slide. What does the literature tell us about material cultural evolution that we might apply to design fiction? This is sort of taking stock of what a lot of literature in the field says. Component analysis is very hard, as I've discussed. Tree topology, that with cultural material or material artifacts, that you don't have strictly branching patterns. You have more network-like patterns where those creating artifacts are borrowing from more than one model. So with like a text, you might just not be simply copying one text, but also incorporating readings from a related text, creating a new composite. This would be oblique or horizontal transmission rather than just vertical transmission. You see this across most studies of phylogenetics applied to artifacts. And then variation is that unlike genetic variation, or what happens in the biological realm, which is blind mutation, right? There's no direction or foresight involved. That with cultural evolution, there is something called guided variation. And that's where people take a model but intentionally alter it in new kinds of ways. So guided variation plays a critical role in the evolution of material culture. And then I want to just briefly return to component analysis. So what are they doing in design fiction? How do they address that problem? A lot of design fiction really is all about provocation. It's really not so much about futurity. What you're looking at here is a device created by Julian Bleecker called the Slow Messenger device. He also has a corresponding project called the Slow Mailed program. And So what this does is that it takes your instant message and it delivers it in a very, very excruciatingly slow fashion to the recipient, like one letter at a time, based on various factors. And it's meant to get you to think critically, reflexively, or reflectively about the instantaneity of communication that we all take for granted now. This is a method of reflective design, or what Donald Norman would call reflective design. This is his 3 teapots, which have been reproduced in his book on emotional design and in lots of other places. And they represent 3 different dimensions or aspects or approaches to design that Norman thinks are interrelated. All 3 are sort of crucial. And the one on the left is the example of reflective design. This is called the masochistic teapot for obvious reasons. The spout is located on the same side as the handle, and so if you try to pour this, hot water out of this teapot, you will scald yourself. And then the other 2 pots represent what he calls visceral design, which is related to emotional attachment to objects, and behavioral design, which is a sort of study and usability. And the point about reflective design is this. This is really what Julian Bleecker and a lot of design fiction artists do. It's about, through provocation, forcing you a sort of estrangement in the way you view an object, right? So suddenly we sort of start thinking critically about the location of a spout or a handle on a teapot, whereas prior to something like this, they seem almost like their location seems almost immutable. It doesn't seem mobile or changeable in any way. So reflective design can get you to start isolating component pieces and then thinking about ways in which you can alter them. So I would say that reflective design gets at some ways at the problem of component analysis. I mentioned multi-methods. I think there are some things that we could do here in the area of lab experiments. We could have test subjects perform component analysis on everyday objects, so wallets, chairs, lamps, toaster ovens, whatever, and see how much consensus there is. If you ask them, what are the component parts of these objects? How much consensus is there across these domains? And I'm sure computer vision has a lot to tell us about this area too. And then another idea would be have test subjects perform component analysis on alien technology. So, create something that doesn't have any semantic meaning to whoever's viewing it. And so when they're no longer able to lean or use semantics as a crutch, how do they then approach the problem of component analysis? The reason I think this method is valuable is that when we're dealing with archaeological artifacts, we don't often know how the objects were used necessarily. And then another difference between cultural evolution and biological evolution, as I mentioned, is that the problem of horizontal or oblique transmission as opposed to vertical transmission. And I sort of explained what that is already. So in media archaeology, which a field that also plays around a lot with design fiction, there's an incredible emphasis on oblique and horizontal transmission. A lot of the artists create objects using assemblage art based on obsolete technologies. So these are called sometimes speculative conglomerations. U.C. Parika has referred to this as time as being pleated. And then it's the idea that they're artwork machines that blend component parts from different historical periods. So this is an example, Tom Jennings' Storyteller, which uses a variety of Cold War era technology components to create this working machine. It uses a paper tape, a teletype machine, and a bunch of other parts that you don't see in this image to encode a narrative about Alan Turing on the paper tape. It takes 8 hours for the tape to make its way from spool to floor over the course of the day. And again, it's a working machine made up of all of these component parts from lots of different technologies. And so the way he's approached this design task is not at all in line with the kind of phylogenetic branching method, right? The relationship of this machine to its parental technologies is all about horizontal and oblique transmission. That's interesting, and I know it's largely a part of a function of like cultural work right now that we tend to eschew linearity and tree-type structures. We gravitate toward rhizomes, right? Deleuze and Gattiari. and these more reticulate structures. This is from Franco Moretti's Graphs, Maps, and Trees, so you might have seen it before. The point I want to make is that those who do phylogenetic research with cultural objects, they do deal with a lot of horizontal and oblique transmission, but they almost always still have a strong phylogenetic signal. That is, the horizontal and oblique transmission doesn't eclipse the overall tree structure. You get locally reticulate areas, but their software is sophisticated enough increasingly to also accommodate this horizontal transmission. I find this kind of structure in some ways more interesting. I think linearity is interesting too. And I think I want to just do a quick time check. How much time, Brian?
About 15.
Okay. So, this is an experiment done by Jennifer Freed and her collaborators in, I think, the 90s. She dubs this phenomenon representational momentum. This is about the power of linearity. Repeatedly test subjects, when confronted with a series of some sort of items in a series, like this. So this is a sequence of rectangles that are sort of graded along the line of thin to thick, right? Her experiments show that test subjects, once you remove the stimulus, repeatedly remember the last item in the series as further along the progression or the continuum than it actually is. That is, mentally or cognitively, they further extend the series. And so this is, and she's looked at this in other areas like music, for example. She's found a complementary idea, auditory momentum. So I want to say that one way to approach design fiction then might be to have this kind of balanced approach where you're retaining a strong phylogenetic signal, but still having these really interesting horizontal and oblique patterns as well. You've probably seen these kinds of things. This is its own genre piece on the web, where you first have maybe just the evolution of famous logos, and then one variation on it is to also plot their future forms. And here you see in the for the Apple logo and the Starbucks logo, very much the designers playfully responding to representational momentum. That is, like for example, in the Starbucks sequence, you've got a series in the real evolution of the logo where the mermaid progressively changes scale. And so they're playing on that idea so that eventually all you have is her face and then she disappears altogether. And you really have something similar with the Apple sequence. So very much a tendency to play with representational momentum here. And this depends on linearity. It's not just, there's more sort of speculative conglomerations that you see in media archaeology. So one idea I've posited, and I've talked about this, it's been in one or two of my publications that I've discussed quite a bit actually with Jeremy John at the British Library. Some of you might know Jeremy John. He's the manuscript or he's the curator of e-manuscripts, electronic manuscripts at the British Library. So any of you in the archival world might know his work. But he's trained as a biologist. He has a PhD in biology. And so he sort of done some work or some initial, floated some ideas around archives in phylogenetics. We've had a number of discussions. And so I think one of the areas that's so interesting in media archaeology and design fiction is playing with counterfactual machines, like the one I showed you, the storyteller, but others too, like this one, which is a Commodore 64 reimagined as a laptop computer, and in some versions of it, it uses a Atari joystick as an input device. So like the storyteller, kind of taking component parts from lots of different machines and bringing them together. So in order to bring that more strong phylogenetic signal approach to design fiction that still has these areas of local reticulate interest, what if we could build a sort of phylogeny or construct a phylogeny, infer a phylogeny for hardware components, right? The history of computer architecture. Now, the historian of technology, Paul Ceruzzi, has called the history of computer hardware a trackless jungle. But I think it would be, and I think Jeremy is interested in this too, in pursuing something like that, which would also have implications for hardware preservation. And then finally, guided variation, which is that third way I mentioned that cultural evolution differs from biological evolution. This is, I'm now doing an exploratory study right now around this. So I wanted to take an example of a series, of a kind of evolutionary series like the logos that involve a lot of guided variation to see how guided variation affects some of these case studies. So this is not a case where you use phylogenetic methods because you already know the historical sequence with the logos. You don't have to reconstruct their sequence, but you can still learn a lot of things about the patterns of change across the different versions. So I wanted to actually try component analysis myself and see what problems I ran into and do a series of case studies. And I'm just now getting started on this. So I first spent a lot of time developing a set of design fiction patterns or unit operations. These are not all of them, but it's maybe 2/3 of them. 14 listed here. These were, I arrived at this set of fit patterns by doing a grounded theory on a range of studies and sources. So these are some of them, not all of them, just a sort of subset. And the ones I've highlighted in red are based on phylogenetic studies. So Alex Masudi's Cultural Evolution, which reports on a lot of phylogenetic studies of cultural evolution. Colin Martindale, which just uses a different sort of set of statistical methods, a big data method, in a really interesting and sometimes maddening book called The Clockwork Muse. And then a really great article by Niles Eldridge, the biologist, and his collaborator on phylogenetics and material cultural evolution, where he, as a biologist, applies phylogenetic methods to his collection of cornets, which are, they're a wind instrument in the trumpet family. So I first compiled a set of transformations or design patterns that I synthesized from all of these different sources, from these and others. It took a long time. And then I started applying them in the classroom. I just wanted to see what students would do with them. I taught Creative Futures in 2011, which was a course devoted to long-term thinking in the service of art, design, and preservation. And these were students who were actually playing Superstruct, the game by Jane McGonigal that I talked about earlier, confronting one of the super threats, the quarantine super threat, which is about a fictional virus or bacteria known as REDS that's threatening the larger population. And so they tackled the idea of gas masks. And after doing some research in materials science and psychology, their idea was that the gas masks, if used consistently, could help prevent further spread of the disease, but that their Darth Vader-esque and dehumanizing properties would prevent that sort of thing. So they had to sort of futurize the gas masks, and they also wanted to turn them into fashion items as a way to, again, sort of get away from the sort of the menacing or frightening aspect of them. And they applied a series of the design patterns to the gas masks. And for time, I'm not going to touch on them very much, but they include things like relocation, amplification, skeuomorphism, in here. And so now I'm applying the patterns to some logo case studies. And then I want to contrast that, because of the high degree of guided variation that you see in their production. And then I want to contrast it with something like the evolution of comic book characters, because their guided variation still plays a role, but you also see something like content biases at work, or maybe something like physiological biases, where the act of copying the characters over and over again also strongly influences their development. And I'm just going to end quickly, just to say that I am in the early stages of this, and I'm just trying to compile some statistical information on using in vivo, which some of you might also use. It's a research software platform that allows you to code non-numerical data and then locate interesting patterns in it, including statistical patterns. So I've been sort of looking at how I divided the images up into component parts for the Starbucks logo, the arms of the figure, the crown, the face, the fins, and so forth, and then started looking at the different transformations that each component part underwent, and then compiling some metrics and graphs around them. So it's still too early because I need to do some more studies, but I am finding some correlations with, for example, some of Bartlett's findings and then some new ones as well. And I'll go ahead and just end with this one, which is a tree structure. Just this chart just shows which characters in the logos are most similarly encoded. That is, which ones use which ones use similar design fiction patterns or unit operations, borrowing from Ian Bogost. And so there's sort of like similarity profiles between the evolution of the component parts of the design. And I'll go ahead and end it there and say thank you very much.
Let's have a few minutes for questions for Kari.
I guess in a kind of broad sense, I understand the importance and emphasis on design, and I'm also interested in what role the arts, the visual arts in general, might also play on this. We did an exhibition a few years ago called Trees and Other Ramifications that was focused on these tree patterns, and both looked at biological issues and some art issues, as well as the structure of thought kind of issues, which is the title of a central work in this exhibition, which was a large photograph by Mike and Doug Starn, or a photographically based work. It's quite striking. And they're more active in what I would perceive as the general arena of the arts as opposed to design, not that the two aren't completely
Right, the more studio art side of it, yeah.
So I'm just wondering what role or use you might see of the arts per se in this line of reasoning.
That's interesting. There are, I think, an increasing number of artists who work in at least related areas. So I'm thinking of someone like Eduardo Kapp, who. So I'm sort of trying to recall on the fly what he's done. But one of the projects that comes to mind is where he took a passage from the Book of Genesis, from the Bible, and converted it into some sort of DNA sequence, and then allowed it to. Maybe somebody can help me out here if they know the project. Was it actually injected into organisms or sort of bacteria, I think, and then he allowed them to mutate under ultraviolet light, and then looked at how the sequence mutated over time and compared the input to the output to the original input. So I mean I think it's a great question, and I also know there is a lab at University of Arizona or Arizona State that is doing a lot of work in future studies and design fiction. They ran a conference last year, and I think they hope to make it an annual event that involved a number of artists, as well as people like Stuart Candy, who I talked about.
And where is that?
It's either University of Arizona or Arizona State. And I can't recall the name of the lab. But it's supposed to be an annual event, and it ran for the first time last year. And then University of Texas, in November, is running a futures conference with Bruce Sterling as one of the keynotes for obvious reasons, and he's also based in Texas. And I think that's actually sponsored by the Harry Ransom Center. So there's a lot of the archives people are actually sponsoring it. So you are seeing a lot of interest in this area across these disciplines. I noticed that University of Michigan I School offered a course about a year ago. It had design fiction on the syllabus. Henry Jenkins has recently taught it on the syllabus. I was actually trying to find different syllabi that incorporated it. So you're seeing it across a lot of different disciplines. I have seen a number of design schools that are advertising on their web pages that they're incorporating design fiction into their programs. But I don't know so much about the studio arts.
So I was thinking about the phylogenetics thing, And I was wondering if you know people who took into account the fact that in design and in art and in literature and things like that, it's a lot more likely that you'll have the development of something totally novel than it is in biology.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's that role again of guided variation.
Yeah.
And where do you find it more pronounced or less pronounced? And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think what you're dealing with is a tension between innovation and stability, right? We're talking about a context in which copying is taking place. So not creating de novo out of nothing, but rather, looking at a series where there is clear intent to copy. So that kind of constrains what you're looking at, helps you scope what you're looking at. But yes, there will be, guided variation will play a more or less critical role, and you're absolutely right that in certain contexts, this is why I think it's important to do case studies too, is to see how that fallout occurs across different examples.